Well, hello everyone. My name is Bart Eisen, and my denomination was the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, and I looked at the sacrament of credo baptism in their denomination. First, I want to say that I apologize for having this put out late. Tonight at around 7:30, I looked at my computer, looked online, and realized, oh goodness, this should have been done on Wednesday. The paper syllabus had said the April 5th, and I didn't think to look at the website. So my apologies for the late submission and maybe some of the challenges it can be to look at my presentation. Like I said, I'll be looking at the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada and Credo Baptism. The Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada is a denomination that was birthed originally in the Azusa Street revivals in 1906, and it's part of that revivalist movement. It is the Canadian counterpart to the Assemblies of God in the United States of America. And I found this denomination to be particularly fascinating. Its roots start in Toronto with men like A.B. Simpson, and Pentecostalism is strong in Canada. And I found it to be a fascinating denomination to consider and look at because though I'm Reformed, I'm a little bit of an oddball as a Reformed Christian in that I'm a continuationist and lean towards third wave Pentecostalism. It's a denomination that's always fascinated me. I've had some exposure to it, and I wanted to learn more about it on a deeper level for this assignment. And to be honest, when I looked at the Pentecostal assemblies and their views of baptism, I was also hoping to touch on their belief in a subsequent baptism, but that isn't what's covered in the scope of this assignment. We're looking strictly at the sacrament of credo, or the ordinance in the Pentecostal assemblies of credo baptism. Now, of course, because they're credo Baptists and do believe in full immersion, their definition fits with those who believe in credo baptism. And actually, Miller J. Erickson, in his book on Christian theology, sums it up well. He says that credo baptism is a baptism that's seen as a token or an outward symbol or identification of the inward change that has been effected in the believer. So baptism in this camp, in the Pentecostal church, is done by immersion, and it's meant to be a picture of the Christian's identification with Christ and an inward change in their life as a result of a choice to follow God. And so for Pentecostals, they affirm what most credo Baptists affirm. Their view of baptism isn't much different. They have some different foci, but for the most part, they affirm credo baptism. So, of course, with credo baptism, they have a strong belief in symbolism. They believe that when the old self is above the water and dunked into the water, the old self dies, and you're under the water, and then you're resurrected into new life. So they believe that Christians identify with Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection in the practice of baptism. Now, of course, for them, baptism is symbolism, and it is not salvific, and they would see it as something that God commands them to do and an act of discipleship, that along the journey they would be called to exemplify the symbolism found in baptism as it pertains to Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. One of the things that's really fascinating about the Pentecostal church and some of their practices, as James K.A. Smith's analogy of the Martian coming to check out a mall in his book, some of the things that you'll see very quickly when you wander into a Pentecostal church on a baptism Sunday is the emphasis on testimony and the emphasis on discipleship. What I mean by that is that testimony is significant for Credo Baptists because baptism is meant to follow someone's belief, someone's choice to follow Jesus. And so for them, they want the believer to share how they came to the decision to follow Jesus. Unlike the Reformed camp, they would see it as man's choice. And so testimony is hugely important when you go to a baptism service, as I did. You see almost always the person being baptized telling a bit of their story and how they came to choose to follow Christ, and how as a natural result of that choice, they felt in their process of discipleship that they must share that with the body of believers. And so this is where we move to discipleship. They see it as a crucial part of the journey of the Christian, that you can believe and discover your faith for a season. And when you choose God and you start to grow in your faith, the next step is to be baptized so you can be held accountable by the Christian community. So they see this as a crucial part in discipleship, because they would understand it as a natural next step once someone's discovered the faith and chosen to believe in the faith. So as a Martian invader, you would see this importance on free will and decision, and you would see a person talking about the experiences that they've had with God. And of course, in Pentecostal circles, this is a very experiential foci. They would really talk about what they felt, what they encountered, how they experienced God, and then talk about even the people who helped bring them to this decision. So mentorship is key. Often the baptism is done by the youth pastor or someone in their lives who have really influenced them in a positive way. Commitment. So another focus of the Pentecostal churches, or a result of the Pentecostal churches' focus on credo baptism, is commitment. One of the things you'll see with credo Baptists in Pentecostal circles is that this is a point, a single decision, after which commitment must follow. So once this decision's been made, they're publicly declaring a commitment to live for Jesus. Much like our profession of faith in Reformed churches, they would see this as a public declaration of their faith and belief, and then a public commitment to follow God for the rest of their lives. That baptism marks the moment when they've decided, okay, from now on, I'm going to commit to following Jesus, much like a couple who goes in front of a church commits to being with each other for the rest of their lives. And of course, we know with Pentecostal and Arminian theology that it's so heavily entrenched in that commitment can be broken, but it is a verbal commitment, and there's an emphasis on this also with regards to accountability, which we'll get to a little bit further on. As I mentioned, accountability is another natural outworking. In my interview with Pastor David Baker of the Pentecostal Church here in Listowel, the town in which I minister, he mentioned the importance of accountability. He would say that he would use a person's baptism date as a way to say to his parishioners or congregants that they must live a holy life, live a life worthy of the gospel, because they promised their community they'd live for Jesus for the rest of their lives. And he would also use this in a positive light with accountability. He would talk about the need for believers to live out of the new identity they have in Christ, the resurrected identity that they have in Christ, and the joy that can result from their decision to be baptized as an encouragement to live out of their new identity. And so accountability is hugely important with credo baptism, much as it would be with profession of faith. And a Martian coming into the church service would see that there are a number of commitments made on both the part of the baptized person and the congregation as to how he or she is to live out their faith. So they would see this commitment made on both sides, and the beginnings of accountability start to take root. And also they may, if they came to a service later on, find that that the pastor is encouraging them to remember their new life in Christ and to live out of that identity as a form of accountability. One of the things that I think we can really learn from the Pentecostal assemblies and credo baptism is human responsibility. We know that in our doctrinal belief system, as those who believe in the elect and God's sovereignty, that for us we focus more heavily on God's will and God's choosing, which is a good thing to rest our identity in, and it gives us great comfort. But one of the things that Pentecostals really emphasize with credo baptism is human responsibility, that after that commitment's been made, they must do their best, because they've committed to the community and to God that they will, to live a better life, to live a life that's worthy of their new identity, that they must make the decisions day in, day out to live out of their identity. So submission is hugely important in Pentecostal circles. They will emphasize submission and human responsibility. They would almost to a fault, believe that it's man's choice and ability to maintain their spiritual health after their baptism, and that the church can encourage them in that, but man must choose to do good. And I think we can learn from that Reformed circle. Sometimes we can rest on God's sovereignty in a way that's unhealthy, and I don't think it's indicative of our theology or our Reformed belief system. I think it's indicative of a misteaching of Reformed doctrine, and sometimes we don't take as much responsibility in our work in partnering with God to do His will and to live a life of gratitude. Interestingly, both denominations would affirm gratitude and living submissively and out of joy as a result of God's work and their identification with Christ in baptism. So one of the things I think we can learn from the Credo Baptist perspective in the Pentecostal assemblies is human responsibility. Another thing I think we can learn from Pentecostal assemblies in their views of credo baptism, and you see this when their pastors talk about it, is new identity. A lot of people will emphasize the forgiveness of God in baptism, but Doug Baker, Pastor Doug Baker, the man I interviewed, he would say pastors don't emphasize the forgiveness element of baptism so much. The justification piece when it comes to baptism, there's more of an emphasis in Pentecostal circles on the new identity as kind of a precursor to their revival, to their spiritual filling. That the new identity is crucial for their development. If they live in that new identity and continue to be filled by the concept of new identity, live out joyfully, they will continue to do greater and greater works for God's glory. So new identity is huge, and I think for us as Reformed Christians, we can learn a lot about that. I think the infant baptism piece, it seems like a decision, and it is a decision made by parents to baptize us, and we see God carrying out His covenant love towards us in baptism, and we forget to live out of the new identity in that, because it's something for many of us, such a long time ago when we were infant baptized, we forget to live out of that new identity, but to remember, hey, even though we were infant baptized, even though we were paedo-baptized, we have a new identity, and that same water that cleanses us and that allows the Pentecostal to identify with Christ, we also identify with Christ through. And so I think we could learn to really live joyfully out of the new identity we have in Christ as a result of baptism. And even more so for us, because it began for us in infancy, and not as a result of our free will or choosing. I do want to wrap up this presentation with some differences and similarities. And I chose this picture very intentionally. I think both have fruit, both perspectives of paedo-baptism and adult baptism that I learned about. Paedo-Baptists believe in covenant and God's work in creating covenant with his children and God's work in redeeming His children. But the symbolism that we use is almost identical. We do identify with Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. We do identify with the new life and seek to live our new identity in Christ as a result of God's work, as symbolized in baptism. So a lot of the symbolism language is very much identical. And the idea, as the Catechism highlights, that we live out of gratitude for what Christ's done and we submit our lives to Him joyfully because of what Christ's done, is very similar to the Pentecostal perspective that would focus on the new life we have in Christ and the need to submit to Him and to live out of gratitude for what God's done. Where it might be a little different is, I think, for Pentecostal, submission and obeying God are tools that allow them to maintain their faith. Not that it's a works gospel, but it spurs them on in faith so that they can't lose it. And so there are some minor differences, but all in all, the imagery, the symbolism, a lot of the elements of baptism in both circles are very similar. Outside of the symbolism and its practicality, there are differences. I mean, Pentecostals focus on choice. They believe that once you've chosen to believe in God, you should choose to be baptized, and they do so as adults because they believe adults have the ability to choose when to follow God, whereas we focus on God's sovereign choosing and God's bringing us into covenant. We focus more on God's election and choice and God's sovereignty in that element. So their emphasis on adult immersion baptism is different than our emphasis on God's sovereign work and God marking out His children in infant baptism. So there is some differences in how it's carried out and some of the beliefs that are the foundation for baptism in between the two denominations, but largely the symbolism and the belief that it's not salvific and the belief that it's part of our identifying with Christ are key similarities that I think should be focused